Good morning, and can I repeat the welcome which I extended on Tuesday to the core participants and others attending today in person. You're very welcome, and I trust you're as comfortable as our fairly restricted accommodation permits. Now, I think Ms. Watts? Good morning, Ms. Watts. Now, you are representing Doctors Inkster, Peters, and Redding.
Yes, my lord. Thank you. Good morning, my lord. These submissions are presented on behalf of Dr. Teresa Inkster, who is now an infection control doctor and a consultant microbiologist at Antimicrobial Resistance and Healthcare Acquired Infections Scotland, Dr. Christine Peters, who is still a consultant microbiologist at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital in Glasgow, and Dr. Penelope Redding, who is a retired consultant microbiologist. These three doctors have become collectively referred to as the whistleblowers, although, as my lord is, I think, aware, Dr. Inkster did not actually formally participate in any whistleblowing process. I will refer to them as the whistleblowers.
I can entirely understand that. Something which occurred to me is, and one sees the use of whistleblowers in a number of situations and in other closing statements. In some ways, it's remarkable that three distinct professional persons are somehow regarded as a group or a partnership, and that something that is said to be true about Dr. Redding is somehow assumed also to be true about Dr. Inkster. Now, if you have any observations on that, I would be interested.
Thank you, my lord. I mean, they do certainly have now, in particular, very different perspectives, because although they at one time held similar jobs in the same organisation, they now work, or in Dr. Redding's case, of course, are retired. They now have very different working lives. But I've taken care to discuss with them the content of the submissions that I'm going to make today, and I'm content that insofar as I'm commenting today, I'm commenting on behalf of all three of them, and I'm representing views that all three of them share, although my lord's quite right to highlight their, at times, very different perspectives on the events that occurred. I will refer to them as whistleblowers, simply for the sake of brevity, my lord, recognising the distinction that my lord has drawn. The inquiry already has the benefit of detailed written submissions that have been prepared on their behalf, and I'll formally adopt those now. The further submissions that I'll make today will focus on three distinct areas. These will be, firstly, the nature and the extent of the apology that's now offered by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to my clients. Secondly, the submission made by GGC to the effect that all of its staff acted in good faith at all times. And thirdly, the extent to which the necessary lessons have truly been learned and the necessary changes instigated. Insofar as the apology is concerned, my lord, I will explain why, although they are relieved to have received an apology, given the events of the last 10 years, the whistleblowers do still have real concerns about the nature and the extent of the apology that's actually being offered to them. In relation to the question of good faith, my lord, I will explain why the whistleblowers do not accept the submission made and repeated several times by NHS GGC to the effect that at all times throughout the events with which this inquiry has been concerned, all GGC staff have acted with good faith towards them. There are, in my submission, a number of examples of what certainly appears to be behaviour that was not well-intentioned, particularly on the part of senior members of NHS GGC's management and directed at the whistleblowers. And in the third part of my submission, my lord, I will outline why, despite the concessions that GGC makes in its closing submission, and which were repeated by Mr. Gray KC during his own submissions this week, the whistleblowers do still have significant concerns about the extent to which the necessary changes have actually been instigated, in particular amongst the senior managers of the Infection Prevention and Control team at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. I wish to make it clear, my lord, that all three of the whistleblowers would much rather have been in a position to instruct me to make a different submission today. They all wish that they could have simply asked me to relay that they are now reassured that things have changed and that they are no longer concerned. But regrettably, my lord, those are not my instructions. I'll now move, my lord, to the first of my three substantive chapters, which will be the apology now offered by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde to the whistleblowers. I would observe at the outset, my lord, that GGC's position now appears to be essentially the polar opposite of the position that was presented to this inquiry, a position which significantly expanded the duration, the scope, and the cost of this inquiry, as well as the burden on patients, families, and whistleblowers. GGC now accept that their management of the issues investigated by the inquiry fell well below what should be expected. They accept that their culture did not encourage reporting of concerns and did not encourage transparency. They accept that there was indeed an exceedance in the rate of environmentally relevant bloodstream infections. They accept that it is more likely than not that a material proportion of those infections had a connection to the state of the hospital's water system. And they accept that there were failures with the design, the build, and the commissioning of the hospital, and further failures by NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde at the handover stage. Insofar as my client's personal positions are concerned, GGC now states in its written submissions that its previous criticisms of them were neither helpful nor fair, and it withdraws them and unreservedly apologises for having made them. This sentiment is expressed in GGC's closing submissions for the first time at the very end of this inquiry and at the end of a decade of treatment of the whistleblowers that has at times been wholly unacceptable. A meaningful and a genuinely felt apology is really important to the whistleblowers. This is not for reasons of personal or professional vanity. As my Lord has already alluded to this morning, although Dr. Inkster and Dr. Peters and Dr. Redding are referred to collectively as the whistleblowers, what they really are, of course, is three highly experienced and highly trained doctors who have always been held in the highest esteem by their patients and by the vast majority of their clinical colleagues, and who are experts in the field of microbiology and infection control. Their job was and is to keep patients safe, and that has always been their number one concern and their priority at all times. The whistleblowers, as this inquiry has heard, were at times simply unable to do their jobs in the ways that they otherwise would have done, because their well-founded and their genuinely held concerns were not investigated properly, openly, or respectfully. And that meant that patients were not always kept safe. And an apology for this lack of an open and respectful response to the raising of concerns, and for the approach that was taken to the whistleblowers in general terms, is important because all the whistleblowers have ever wanted to achieve was genuine reassurance that what had happened to them would not happen to any other clinicians who raised concerns in the future, and that patient safety would therefore be better safeguarded. And if those staff members, and particular senior management staff still working in NHS GGC, who were responsible for the wholly unacceptable way in which GGC as an organisation responded to the whistleblowers when they raised their concerns, if those staff members were genuinely sorry and recognised the mistakes that they had made, then that would provide the whistleblowers with considerable reassurance, my Lord, for the future. I note that Mr. Gray wishes to avoid being drawn into any criticism of individuals who work for NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, certainly in relation to this chapter of the matters that the inquiry has been investigating. But the practical reality is that there are currently working within the infection prevention and control team at the QEUH individuals, including the Director of Infection Prevention and Control, who must bear some personal responsibility for the unacceptable treatment that my clients received over the course of a decade. These are individuals who consistently maintained that there was no exceedance or spike in infections, and that my clients were not only wrong to suggest that there was, but that in expressing what are now accepted to be well-founded and properly expressed concerns about unusual infections, my clients were said by these individuals to be acting in bad faith, to be attention-seeking, sensationalizing, or ignoring basic identified principles of infection control. A genuine apology from those who are actually responsible for what went wrong here would go some way to demonstrating real remorse and a real desire to learn from the serious mistakes of the past, and would provide the whistleblowers with the reassurance that patient safety will be safeguarded from now on. But the apology, which is now offered on behalf of NHS GGC, is expressly not such an apology. Instead, as ever, GGC prefer to present things at a very high level and to apologise for what is described as a culture, but not for any specific failures by any individuals. This inquiry heard from a large number of witnesses, my lord, who were past and present senior employees of GGC. Every single one of those witnesses could have said at any point during their evidence that they acknowledged that the whistleblowers were raising valid concerns in good faith, that the response that they received from GGC was unacceptable, and that the whistleblowers deserved an apology for how they were treated. Any of those witnesses, my lord, could have given that evidence to allow this inquiry to be satisfied that the organisation had fundamentally changed, and that the culture, which ultimately led to the requirement to convene this inquiry, no longer existed. However, my lord, not a single witness gave that evidence.
Well, certainly it was after a number of questions, but I have Dr. Scott Davidson, who is the current medical director, giving evidence on the 9th of October, and it's column 49 in the transcript. As I say, there were a number of questions which took him to what I have noted as there should be an acknowledgement to these colleagues, and what I understood him to be saying should be acknowledged is that the whistleblowing should not have been necessary. I think that's my only recollection.
I was going to deal with Dr. Davidson's evidence, my lord. I'll do that. No, I'm happy to simply do that now. So, as my lord has identified, Dr. Davidson is indeed the current medical director, and he was asked specifically whether the whistleblowers should receive an apology. That was in the context of him acknowledging that accident and emergency consultants who had also participated in a whistleblow had received an apology. And Dr. Davidson was asked whether the whistleblowers in this inquiry should also receive an apology. I've looked at the same section of the transcript that my lord is referring to, and my lord might recall that when he's asked whether or not the whistleblowers should receive an apology, Dr. Davidson answers that question with, "So, I think we're sitting in a public inquiry." And from then on, his failure to directly answer the question of whether the whistleblowers should receive an apology or not was raised during the adjournment at the end of his first passage of evidence. I asked for it to be clarified as part of the Rule 9 process, and he was asked to clarify what he meant because it wasn't possible to discern a clear answer from the evidence that he'd already given. And my lord will have seen, having looked back at the transcript, that over the next 2 full pages of transcript, Dr. Davidson continues to avoid providing a direct answer to the question that he was asked. Counsel to the inquiry eventually had to specifically point out to him that he was not able to detect an answer to the question that had been asked. and specifically asked him to consider dealing with the matter in terms of a yes or no answer. And only at that point, and this is, as my lord has said at column 49, only at that point, what he said was, so I'm obviously one member of the board, and I feel that, yes, there should be an acknowledgement to those whistleblowers. So even then, he was still avoiding actually using the word apology. And it's worth noting, my lord, that Dr. Davidson also avoided providing a direct answer to his to key questions about the whistleblowers in his witness statement. If my lord looks at his August 2025 whistle statement, and in particular to page 23 of that document, Dr. Davidson is specifically asked whether the concerns raised by the whistleblowers were valid concerns, and he simply does not answer that question at all. So the whistleblowers read his statement carefully, and they listened to his evidence, and they did not detect an apology. But much more importantly, my lord, they do not feel reassured by Dr. Davidson's evidence that the necessary fundamental cultural change is actually underway.
Sorry, just give me that again, Ms. Watts. They do not discern.
So they listened to his evidence and they read his statement,
Yes.
and they were unable to identify an apology. But more importantly, because this is much more important to my clients than the question of whether or not they personally receive an apology, more importantly, they did not find his evidence reassuring from the perspective of identifying real fundamental cultural change. And Dr. Davidson is important, my lord. I mean, a great number of witnesses could be criticised in similar ways, but Dr. Davidson is important because he is the current medical director. So not only does he still work in NHS GGC, but he holds that very senior role. And there are other individuals in similarly senior and important roles in relation to which similar issues could be raised. And I'll deal with just two of them. Sandra Devine, who's the current Director of Infection Prevention and Control, and the Chief, excuse me, my lord, and the Chief Executive, Professor Gardner. So the current Director of Infection Prevention and Control first, my lord, provided a lengthy witness statement.
Should I be looking at your written closing statement at this point, or can I simply just...
I think at this point you can probably simply just
listen,
my lord. Yes, thank you. The current director provided a lengthy statement, and also, my lord, will of course recall, gave evidence to the inquiry. And I don't propose to take my lord to the statement, but in the context of this submission that is being made about fundamental cultural change, I think it's important to remember the evidence that was actually given to this inquiry by the people who are responsible now for setting the tone and dictating the culture within the infection prevention and control team at the QEUH. So there are a couple of passages from Ms. Devine's statement that I would particularly draw my lord's attention to. At paragraph 155, my lord...
Sorry, just, no, I simply can't recollect. Ms. Devine provided one witness statement.
That's my recollection, my lord.
Right.
Or certainly she provided one recollection. She provided one recollection. I'm sorry, my lord. She provided one witness statement in advance of giving her evidence. That I'm now questioning myself and wondering if there was a supplementary statement after that. But it's the original statement that I'm referring to,
right,
my lord. So at paragraph 155 of that original statement, Ms. Devine, who is still the Director of Infection Prevention and Control, and for whom Dr. Peters still requires to work, stated at paragraph 155 that Dr. Peters was unable to work in partnership with colleagues. At paragraph 164, my lord will see that she describes the level of scrutiny that she was receiving from the whistleblowers, and in particular from Dr. Peters, as intolerable. At paragraph 172, she makes an allegation against Dr. Peters that in investigating concerns, Dr. Peters is said to have improperly accessed material about infections. So the message is not whether Dr. Peters was right to be concerned, but rather that she shouldn't have been looking. At paragraph 178, Ms. Devine refers to issues as having been identified first in October 2017. And that is an issue with which the whistleblowers take real issue, my lord.
Do you want to give me a heads up on what the issues were?
Well, I think the matters...
Well, I'll just listen.
I think that the matters are probably quite fully canvassed in our written submissions,
Right,
but I think it's a high-level point I'm seeking to make, my lord, which is if it is being maintained that these issues did not come to light before October 2017, that is simply not right. And the inquiry has available to it an extensive body of material, including contemporaneous emails, that make it clear that these issues were first identified and raised time and time again, starting more than 2 years before October 2017, as the author of this statement is or ought to be well aware. And finally, my lord, just on this point of what features in the statement, at paragraph 502, there's reference to what's said to be a deliberate attempt by Dr. Peters to undermine the work of the IPCT. And that is an allegation that my lord will see repeated multiple times throughout that statement. So again, my lord, if we are looking at the evidence that was actually provided to the inquiry, as opposed to simply the assertions that are now being made, my clients do not find the evidence to be reassuring on the question of whether there is a fundamental cultural shift in how people raising concerns will be approached. And that was also the case, my lord, in relation to the evidence that was given by the current chief executive. She was also specifically asked, my lord, whether the whistleblowers that I represent should receive an apology. And my lord has already referred to the passage of the transcript that I was going to refer to. So I won't take my lord back to it in any detail or take up time reading from the transcript. But suffice to say, I agree with my lord's interpretation of what's contained in the transcript, and in particular agree that it does not actually contain an apology.
Does it include the word apology?
No, my lord. I've not been able to find anything that resembles an apology directed at my clients. I think, again, this is a passage that my lord himself referred to. At one point, Professor Gardner, that she said that she was sorry that my clients did not feel listened to, which is very different from saying that GGC did not listen to them and that GGC are sorry about that. Even the passage that GGC identify in their written submission as amounting to an apology, and this is paragraph 3.5 of GGC's closing written submission, where they excerpt a section from Professor Gardner's evidence and characterize it as amounting to an apology, is, in my submission, self-evidently not actually an apology to the whistleblowers.
It's put forward as an encapsulation.
Again, my lord, I cannot emphasize enough that the whistleblowers do not want an apology simply for the sake of it or for reasons of professional vanity. What they want is to be genuinely reassured that things have and will change. And as I've already said, they are not currently reassured of that. And I'm afraid, my lord, that events since the evidence concluded has added to their concerns in that regard. My lord will recall that earlier this week, counsel to the inquiry referred to a letter which all three of the whistleblowers were sent by Professor Gardner, and those three letters have been submitted to the inquiry and are available. They all received essentially the same letter, and I agree with the...
Well, I'd say essentially, is the wording not identical?
Indeed, my lord, it is, save for the address, obviously. But I agree with the observation that counsel to the inquiry offered, that it is surprising that it was thought appropriate to simply cut and paste the same letter and send it to three very different individuals. One, somebody who's completely retired, one, somebody who no longer works for the organisation and indeed works in a very senior role in a national body, and finally, someone who is a current full-time employee of the organisation.
All the letters, I think, are the letters of the 13th of January?
That's correct, my lord. Yes. With my lord's leave, I'll just read aloud a couple of passages from the letter. It begins by stating that within my evidence at the SHI, I outlined my objective to improve opportunities in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde for the balanced views of our staff to be heard and to learn from previous experiences. I recognise that we need to build capacity to support healing and repair relationships as we progress into the organisation's next chapter. And it then goes on to say, my lord, aligned with this commitment, you may also be aware that NHS GGC and NSS have commissioned external management support to work across the infection control teams of both NHS GGC and RHI to assist with the building of relationships to support enhanced collaboration going forward. It is hoped this engagement will re-establish trust across our respective teams. So my lord's already identified that these three letters were written on the 13th of January, which is, of course, after GGC lodged written submissions in which they indicated that their organisational position was one of a full and unreserved apology to the whistleblowers. So against that background, the letter from Professor Gardner is as striking for what it doesn't say as it is for what it does say. It does not say, my lord, that GGC is sorry for what happened to the whistleblowers, either before or during this inquiry. And instead, my lord, essentially, it just consists of phrases that amount to management speak, and from which I would respectfully suggest that it's difficult to discern any real meaning.
Sorry, difficult to
discern any real meaning, my lord. Now, it's of course accepted, my lord, that giving evidence to this inquiry over many hours is a difficult task, and one might not always express oneself as clearly as one might have wished with the benefit of hindsight. However, if Professor Gardner felt that perhaps she had not been as clear or gone quite as far as she would have wished in her evidence, in making it clear that she wished to offer a full and an unreserved apology to my clients, then these letters provided an obvious opportunity to correct that oversight, but it is an opportunity that Professor Gardner obviously chose not to pursue. And instead, we see phrases like opportunity to balance views and rebuild trust on both sides, which suggests two well-intentioned parties with conflicting positions, and also suggests a return to a previous approach taken by GGC, which was to focus on personality and relationship issues at the expense of actually engaging substantively with the clinical concerns that were being raised. So these letters, my Lord, do not, in my submission, reflect what is said at paragraph 4.5 of the GGC submission, what is said to be an unreserved apology for the treatments that my clients received. And the whistleblowers do not believe that these letters, which they've now received, are demonstrative of any real change. That's all that I want to say, my Lord, about the question of the apologies that are now offered by NHS GGC. So with my Lord's leave, I'll move on to the second part of my submission, which is to address GGC's position on good faith. Now, it's entirely a matter of course for my Lord to accept or to reject the submission that's now made on behalf of GGC, to the effect that all of its staff have acted in good faith at all times throughout all of the events that this inquiry has considered. GGC do not offer a particular definition of what is meant by good faith, so I am proceeding on the basis that what is intended to be conveyed is a sentiment that the actions of all staff were well-intentioned at all times. And I'm afraid, my Lord, that the whistleblowers simply do not accept that there has never been any bad faith directed towards them. There are, in my submission, a number of examples of behaviour directed towards the whistleblowers which are simply not consistent with being done in good faith or being well-intentioned. And I'm going to mention two today, my Lord. Firstly, position paper 1, and secondly, the S-bar of November 2024. There are, of course, many other examples. I would suggest that the circumstances in which Dr. Inkster was removed as the chair of the water IMT is such an example, but I've already made detailed submissions about those, so I won't rehearse those here, but I do think, given the submission that's now made about good faith, it's worth taking a little bit of time to look at position paper 1 and at the November 2024 S-bar. So I'll start, my Lord, with position paper 1. This document has already been considered at length, but there are a couple of matters which in my submission do bear repeating. My Lord will recall that at paragraph 63 of position paper 1, I can give my Lord the bundle reference if that would assist, although Perhaps it's already available. Paragraph 63 of position paper 1, Dr. Inkster is specifically accused of having misled a patient's parents. At paragraph 69 of position paper 1, the whistleblowers are said to have made false allegations against their colleagues, to have made false allegations about the accuracy of public statements by the board, to have deliberately failed to follow proper processes in airing their concerns, to have made excessive and unnecessary demands of the IPCT, estates and facilities, and IMTs, to be guilty of basic failures relating to risk management and observing recognised scientific principles, to have provided inaccurate information to patients, families, the media, and politicians, and to have breached their patients' confidentiality. And it is, in my submission, difficult to imagine a worse response to whistleblowers than to produce a list of allegations like this and then to have to withdraw them because no witness will substantiate them.
Can I just take that again? Difficult to imagine a worse
response to whistleblowers than to make a list of allegations like that and then to have to withdraw them because no witness is prepared to substantiate them. Dr. Peters, my lord, has had to go to work every day through this inquiry and in the lead up to it and deal with the people who said these things about her. Her other professional colleagues and her friends and her family were all aware that these allegations were being made against her by her employer and that she was being accused of dishonesty and incompetence. And the same is, of course, true of Dr. Inkster and Dr. Redding, although they've subsequently left GGC's employment. So given the nature of what was said in position paper 1, I would suggest that GGC's position now, which is that what was said wasn't helpful or fair, is something of an understatement, given the nature of the allegations that were made against whistleblowers who were raising well-founded concerns in good faith. At paragraph 4.6 of GGC's closing submission, it stated that this position paper was produced on a counsel-to-counsel basis in order to assist previous counsel to the inquiry in understanding the position of GGC on a wide variety of issues. Now, clearly, I can't make any comment on the basis upon which the document was submitted, and indeed no detail or explanation of that is offered by GGC. But from the whistleblower's perspective, GGC's position on this just makes it worse, because this was intended to be a list that my clients would not see. So these incredibly serious allegations would be made against them. They wouldn't know about them, and they would never have the chance to defend themselves. GGC specifically state, my lord, in paragraph 4.6 of their closing submission that position paper 1 was submitted in good faith, and that is not accepted by my clients. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not suggesting that Mr. Gray or Ms. Toner have acted anything other than properly in recording the position as stated to them by their client in this document. But the fact that counsel were provided with this position in the first place, when no witness was actually able to support any of it, does not appear to the whistleblowers to be consistent with good faith or with well-intentioned actions.
Well, as I recollect what Mr. Gray, and let's just underline how you start this. You're making no adverse criticism of Mr. Gray,
No.
and there's no reason to do so. However, he explained to me that what appears in position paper 1 was on the basis of material that was put before him by GGC. Now, he may have used the word witness statements, but first of all, that may have been sort of general, because inquiry witness statements had not been taken at that stage. But as I understand it, material sufficient to satisfy him that he could make these statements had been put to him.
And I'm not for a second suggesting that that's anything other than a properly made submission, my lord.
But he accepted, as you've just said, that they were not supported, in his view, by the evidence-led inquiry.
Indeed, my lord. And in fact, my lord might recall the evidence of Professor Steele, who still holds a very senior role within NHS GGC, whose witness statement was very critical of the whistleblowers. And I asked at the end of his evidence, via the Rule 9 process, for him to be specifically asked whether the criticisms that were listed in position paper 1 were directed at Dr. Peters or Dr. Inkster or Dr. Redding. And he said they were not. But I've already made a submission about whether my lord should accept that evidence or not in my written submissions. But I mean, the point is an obvious one, my lord. There's nobody else they possibly could have been referring to. But he wasn't even willing to accept that the document related to the whistleblowers, even though it self-evidently does. So that, my lord, unless my lord has any particular issues about position paper 1, is all that I would propose to say about it. And I'll move on now to deal with the November 2024 SBAR.
Yes.
This is in bundle 52, my lord. Volume 5, and it's page 148.
Can I just take that from you again? Bundle
52, volume 5, page 148. And this in my submission is a really important document. It provides the most contemporaneous evidence, as opposed to assertion, that the inquiry has of the current attitudes of the senior leadership of the Infection Prevention and Control team at the QEUH. No author is identified, no individual author is identified, but as the inquiry knows, NHS GGC employs a Director of Infection Prevention and Control and a lead infection control doctor, and the holders of those roles now held those roles at the point when this document was produced, so it seems reasonable in my submission to assume that one or both of them must bear some responsibility for the content of this document.
Right, can I just get that from you again? The document, as I recollect, is, as it were, attributed to the Infection Prevention and Control team, is that?
That's correct, my lord.
And can I just take from you again what you said following no individual author?
So, of course, my lord, so no individual author is identified, but as my lord knows, NHS GGC employs an individual in the role of Director of Infection Prevention and Control, that's Sandra Devine, and also employs a lead infection control doctor, Dr. Begrad. And the holders of those roles also, my understanding is that they also had those positions in November 2024. So in my submission, it seems reasonable to assume, in the absence of an identified author, that one or both of those individuals must bear responsibility for the content of this document. And indeed, my Lord, if one considers the terms of the Vale of Leven inquiry report, and in particular, I would direct my Lord to recommendation 46, that inquiry recommended that the infection control manager must have direct responsibility for the infection prevention and control service and for its staff. So if that recommendation has been implemented in GGC, then again, that would tend to suggest that the Director of Infection Prevention and Control, which I understand is the role formerly known as Infection Control Manager, the person holding that role is ultimately responsible for the Infection Prevention Control Service and for its staff, and therefore must have some responsibility for this document. My Lord heard earlier in the week my learned friend Mr. Gray offering an excuse of the unprecedented events and the unprecedented pressures that existed to justify behaviour during some of the earlier events that this inquiry has looked at. But even if my Lord is satisfied by those excuses in relation to earlier events, and I say that he should not be, such an excuse cannot reasonably be said to mitigate the preparation of this document in November 2024. My Lord will see that this document was prepared on the 20th of November 2024, which is about 6 weeks after the Director of Infection Prevention and Control gave evidence to this inquiry. The lead ICD, Dr. Begrad, has not given evidence to this inquiry, although my client's firm view is that she should have done, and we requested on a number of occasions that she did. My Lord will recall that Professor Gardner sent this SBAR on to the Director General for Health and Social Care at the Scottish Government on the 25th of August of 2025. And this document, my Lord, goes to the heart of the central premise, or certainly what I understand to be the central premise of the GGC closing submission, which seems to be that insofar as they did things wrong, they are sorry. That insofar as they did things wrong, they have learned and are continuing to learn the necessary lessons, and also that everyone has done their best to act in good faith throughout. And in my submission, analysis of this SBAR document and the approach that was taken to it by Professor Gardner cast significant doubt on all three of those propositions. My Lord will see under the heading Assessment in the document, the following passage appears. It's said by the authors that there have been multiple statements recently made by the whistleblowers RHI colleagues and experts appointed to the public inquiry criticising NHS GGC compliance with the National Infection Prevention and Control Manual and requirements for reporting infection episodes to RHI. All these opinions have been based on incomplete information, biased by people's personal beliefs and interests, trying to sensationalize the fact that if there is a case of Cryptococcus, it most likely will be found in a patient hospitalized in or linked to QEUH. These statements have been made without providing any evidence or facing any consequences for giving misleading information. Now, that is not in my submission suggestive of an author or authors who are sorry, who have learned the necessary lessons, or who always act in good faith. Instead, what we see in the SBAR is simply another set of incredibly serious and utterly baseless allegations of bias and giving deliberately sensationalized and misleading information to this inquiry being made against both the whistleblowers and their professional colleagues at RHI. And this document was simply sent on by the current chief executive, even though it obviously contains allegations which she should not simply have transmitted without initiating a detailed inquiry as to how on earth a document of this nature had come to be prepared. Again, returning to the Veil of Legal inquiry, my lord, that inquiry recommended, this is recommendation 47, that there should be a direct reporting line between the infection control manager and the chief executive. And the chief executive should, in my submission, clearly have been using that line of communication here before simply rubber stamping and sending this SBAR on. The whistleblowers, my lord, believe that if GGC had truly learned the necessary lessons to ensure that the issues that arose in relation to my clients are not repeated, then as soon as this document came to light, it would have been unreservedly withdrawn rather than transmitted to the government, and it would have been apologised for, and those who are responsible for preparing it would have been subjected to an appropriate disciplinary process.
I think I missed what immediately you said after if. What was the premise to what followed?
So my clients are concerned that if GGC had truly learned the lessons and implemented the changes to ensure that what happened to my clients couldn't be repeated, then this document would have been withdrawn and apologised for. And those who are responsible for preparing it would have been the subject of a full and appropriate disciplinary process.
Withdrawn by whom?
I suppose by the chief executive, my lord. Obviously, we don't know where this document went. I certainly don't know where it went, other than that it was sent to RHI and it was sent to Caroline Gardner, who's the Director General for Health and Social Care. Right. I don't know where else it might have been transmitted.
It's dated the 20th of November 2024. Now that is about 3 months prior to Professor Gardner
It is.
Being in post. And my recollection is that Miss Grant, who would have been the chief executive at that date, she demitted office I think our evidence is that in January 2025, so there was not a gap. I can look again at Professor Gardner's evidence, but I don't know if this is intended as some sort of handover document.
I don't know, my lord, I'm afraid. But what I do know is that on the 25th of August of 2025, so after Professor Gardner had been in post for some time and must have had a degree of familiarity with the issues with which this inquiry has been concerned, she elected simply to send this on to the Director General for Health and Social Care. And my submission is that if, and I don't know when this first crossed her desk, this document, my submission is that the proper response would have been one of horror, that people had seen fit to reduce allegations like that to writing, and an appropriate inquiry of how it came to be prepared, rather than simply to send it on to the government, which is what, in fact, Professor Gardner did. Now, that concludes, my lord, unless my lord has any questions, that concludes what I want to say about the question of good faith and well-intentioned behaviour. But suffice to say, the whistleblowers simply do not accept that the behaviour which NHS GGC have inflicted upon them has at all times been well-intentioned and the product of good faith. Now, the third, my lord, of my three substantive chapters is to offer the whistleblowers' views on the current working culture and what that means for patient safety. As has already been said this week, infection prevention and control is indeed a multifactorial process, and the culture and the attitude of the senior leadership of the infection prevention and control team is a critical aspect of this multifactorial process. If that culture and attitude is flawed, then the infection control team will not operate effectively. And the lack of an effectively operating infection prevention and control team will render the hospital unsafe. Dr. Peters still works in the hospital as a full-time employee of NHS GGC. No one has apologised to her for the baseless allegations made against her, and no one has told her, other than through the conduit of the submissions now lodged in this inquiry, that any of those very serious allegations are withdrawn. My instructions from Dr. Peters are that she has not seen evidence of the necessary changes having taken place. Her consistent and repeated experience up until the present date is that the culture has not changed. Learning has not been implemented. And there remains a default assumption that the environment cannot be the cause of infections. Dr. Peters tells me that she feels that she is treated with a combination of mistrust and of hostility from senior managers when she's at work. She tells me that information is withheld from her by the senior leadership of the Infection Prevention and Control team at the QEUH, who she believes continue to view her as a troublemaker, who asks difficult questions and who is best avoided. She wishes, my lord, that this were not true, but her genuinely held belief is that it is. And she doubts whether any real change can be achieved with the current IPCT leadership in place. And that is a view that my other two clients entirely agree with. Dr. Inkster is in a position to offer an informed view on this because she deals regularly with the current QEUH IPCT leadership in her new role at RHI. And she tells me that she also sees no evidence of any learning, insight, or contrition. So to the extent that GGC are attempting to reassure the inquiry that all is now and will continue to be well, that position is simply not accepted by the whistleblowers. And for that reason, my lord, the whistleblowers were concerned to note Mr. Connell's submission earlier this week to the effect that he agreed with recommendations sought by my clients about oversight of the ventilation and the water systems at the hospital, but he did not agree that the same oversight of the infection prevention and control team was required. For the avoidance of doubt, my lord, my clients regard that as the most important area in which further oversight is required, not the least.
Do you, on what you've described as oversight of the infection prevention and control, is it team or service?
It's the senior leadership of the infection prevention and control team at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. And I think that's an important point to make, my lord, because my clients are not making and would not wish to be associated with the suggestion that they've made allegations about the many colleagues who they greatly value and respect, not in the senior leadership of the IPCT or working in infection and prevention and control in GGC, not in the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital.
Now, in your written closing statement, do you address that topic? I mean, I've read your closing statement, but I can't recollect at this moment everything that's in it.
We address specifically the recommendation that there needs to be oversight of the senior leadership of the QEUH
My concern
IPCT
was that
team.
I couldn't immediately see what that might amount to, but I can find that in the closing
There's a
statement.
suggested recommendation, my lord, yes. My lord will be pleased to hear I just have a few more points to make. I'm nearly finished. Essentially, the whistleblowers have asked me to relay that having listened carefully to the, to the submissions of Mr. Gray KC, it appears to them that the inquiry is being asked to accept assertions of fundamental and ongoing change, but with no actual evidence to support those assertions. GGC have previously made assertions to the inquiry, including in position paper 1, for instance, and it has turned out that in fact there was no evidence to support those assertions. So the inquiry should be extremely reluctant to simply accept bare assertion at face value in these circumstances. I note that my lord has asked GGC to produce a document setting out the nature and the extent of the change that's taking place and what more is planned. And I would ask that those who I represent get the opportunity to consider and to respond to that when it is produced.
Well, they certainly will have access to it as a document in the inquiry. I think what follows on, I think, has to be for further consideration. I mean, there, as you'll appreciate, exchange of views has to come to an end at some point.
I entirely appreciate, my lord, that that's of course the case, but I had rather thought that was happening this week. And in fact, it would appear that GGC are being given a further opportunity to represent a position. So I would respectfully suggest that it's important that my clients are given an opportunity to respond to that. But I'm quite content to cross that bridge when we come to it, my lord. Now, an unrelated matter, I note that very serious allegations that have previously been made about counsel to the inquiry have been repeated by GGC in their submissions this week. And it rather appears to me that one of the many difficulties associated with being counsel to an inquiry is that it's impossible to keep everyone happy. But I am bound to say that those who I represent have never felt that they were on the receiving end of the sort of preferential treatment or bias that is alleged by GGC. And I also feel fairness requires me to point out that I'm quite sure that Mr. McIntosh in particular will have less than fond memories of me remonstrating with him forcefully and at length on the many occasions when I felt that actually it was GGC and not those who I act for who were being advantaged by the approach taken by the inquiry. And I also feel, again, in fairness to Mr. McIntosh, that it's important to point out that those who I act for listen very carefully to the evidence, and a large number of Rule 9 questions were prepared and sent to him and Mr. Connell for their consideration. And whilst they were good enough to ask quite a lot of them, there were also a large number that they declined to ask. So I simply make all of those observations, my lord, just to perhaps provide a bit of context to the suggestion that myself and my clients have been on the receiving end of the benefit of a biased team of counsel to the inquiry, because that certainly hasn't been my experience or perception of things.
Right. So the position I'm in is that Mr. Gray's clients feel that they were harshly treated, or their witnesses were harshly treated, and your clients feel that they were harshly treated.
For the avoidance of doubt, my clients have no complaint to advance in relation to counsel to the inquiry, and that's not what I'm seeking to do. I'm merely pointing out that it's very difficult as counsel to the inquiry to keep everyone happy, and there were certainly times when neither me nor those who I represent were happy. So the suggestion that things have been dealt with in a biased and one-sided manner is not accepted. Finally, my lord, my clients would wish to conclude by having me say that they believe that the most amazing things are done in the QEUH every day by incredibly dedicated and skilled staff. And all that they have ever wanted to do was contribute to the positive change that all of those staff, and more importantly, their patients, deserve. And they are very concerned, my lord, that if this inquiry were simply to accept a statement made by GGC and contrary to the evidence that has actually been led before this inquiry, that the organisation has and is continuing to change fundamentally, and that all is and will be well, then my clients fear that their efforts to improve patient safety at the QEUH, which have come at enormous personal and professional expense, will have been in vain. Unless there's anything else which my lord would wish me to address, those are my submissions.
No, I have a very full written statement.
Thank you.
Which I will obviously spend some time on, as with all the other written statements. Thank you, Ms. Watts.
Thank you.
Now, Ms. Connolly, I think you're the next person I would wish to call on. Would it be convenient if we took our coffee break now and invited you to address the inquiry following the coffee break?
Yes, my lord, thank you.
Right. It occurs to me that because we have more people who I hope will be able to provide coffee to, might be wise to be a little bit generous on the coffee break. If I was to ask you to be back for 11:45, would that give you sufficient time this morning?
It may result in me running over by 5 or 10 minutes beyond 1 o'clock, my lord, but I would try and.
Well, we can accommodate that by maybe abbreviating the, maybe you might want to liaise with Mr. Love as to how you can best use the time. But I think I will suggest that we rise now and try and be back for 11:45 in the hope that everyone who wants coffee can have coffee.
Please stand.
Ms. Conley. No. Good morning, Ms. Conley. You represent the Cudahy and Mackay families.
I do, my lord. And my lord, on behalf of those families, I thank you for the opportunity to make the following oral submissions. I formally adopt the written closing submissions laid before the inquiry. My lord, I wish to record the thanks of those whom I represent for the opportunity to participate in this inquiry. We acknowledge the dedication and hard work of the whole inquiry team in conducting the inquiry. We trust that all of our submissions to date and recommendations will be considered by your lordship in reaching his final determination of the terms of reference. My lord, my submissions this morning will be in 3 chapters. Chapter 1 identifies the aspirations or rights contained within the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'll refer to as UNCRC, and also Getting It Right for Every Child, QEUH, which I respectfully submit are relevant to terms of reference 8. My lord, the second chapter will comprise a brief response to the closing submissions of NHS GGC. And my third chapter reflects on the experiences of the Cudahy and Mackay families, incorporating the words of Molly and John Cudahy and Ailey and Lisa Mackay. My lord, turning to chapter 1, UNCRC and QEUH. Prior to identifying the aspirations or rights contained within the UNCRC and QEUH that are relevant to terms of reference 8, I wish to briefly set out why UNCRC and QEUH are relevant to this public inquiry. QEUH is the Scottish Government's commitment to provide all children, young people, and their families with the right support at the right time, so that every child and young person in Scotland can reach their full potential. QEUH takes a rights-based approach with its principles upholding UNCRC. Both documents have a shared perspective where all children and young people are recognised as individuals and rights holders, and where their human rights are embodied in all aspects of society. My lord, QEUH is not a slogan. It is the national framework that is meant to run as a golden thread through every decision affecting children in Scotland, including those taken by health boards. It sets out a clear expectation that all agencies will work together to get it right for every child by safeguarding their well-being across the Shinari indicators.
No, you may have to bring me up to speed on that.
My Lord, SHANARI is the acronym that represents that children are to be safe, healthy, achieving, nurtured, active, respected, responsible, and included.
And I suppose I should be able to work this out, but the letters which make up the
SHANARRI.
SH.
A for apple, N. A for apple, RRI.
Right. And that is found in GIFREG.
Yes, my Lord.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
My Lord, for a tertiary children's hospital, this translates into a duty to provide care and environments that are not only technically competent, but are demonstrably safe, coordinated, rights-based, and centred on the child and family. My Lord, the role of UNCRC principles and QEUH were confirmed and by the Children's Commissioner, Bruce Adamson. My Lord, prior to the commencement of this inquiry, Professor Cudahy had contacted Mr. Adamson, and following the announcement of the inquiry, he wrote to the Cabinet Secretary, and a copy of that letter was previously supplied to the inquiry.
And I take it we've included it in a bundle.
My Lord, that's something that I'm not sure that I can find. I have tried to, but I'm not sure that I can find it. If your Lordship would rather that I didn't mention the contents of the letter.
That's not the point. It's just to make sure that it's available for me to read. And therefore, you may wish to check with the inquiry team. If we don't have it in the bundle, you may need to supply it again, but it's just a question of making sure I'm able to read it.
Of course, my Lord, and I had anticipated that you may wish an additional copy, and that will be made available to the inquiry. Within that letter, my Lord, to the Cabinet Secretary, the Children's Commissioner seeks assurance that any public inquiry will take a human rights-based approach in line with the Scottish Government's commitment to incorporate the UNCRC into Scots law and to embed human rights within the work of government. He states that in taking such an approach, it is important to recall that human rights are interdependent, indivisible, and interrelated. And he provides the example, my Lord, using Article 24 of UNCRC, which is the right to the highest attainable standards of health. to state that that depends, and fulfilment of that article depends on other rights being similarly respected. In particular, Article 13 provides the right to receive and impart information. Whilst Article 12 requires children to be able to participate in decisions made about and for them.
In that context, should I also have regard to the Children's Act of 1995?
Well, my lord, the QEUH principles are incorporated in the Children and Young People Act of 2014.
Right, so I'm rather behind the curve in that case.
And my understanding, my lord, is that the UN CRC was directly incorporated into Scots law in a 2024 Act. And again, my lord, these are things that I can provide the inquiry team with details of for your lordship's assistance.
Just from a note, the 2014 Act, the title?
Children and Young People Scotland Act.
And then you're going to give me the detail of the statute incorporating the UN Convention?
Yes, my lord, but I've failed on that front as I don't have the name of that particular statute to hand. However, I will identify it over its notes that are on my desk, my lord. My lord, we submit that your consideration of terms of reference 8 directly engages the rights and aspirations of both UNCRC and QEUH. Hospitalisation of children in Scotland is managed through the QEUH framework. And QEUH applies to hospitalised children by requiring that, firstly, the child's and family's needs and voice are all central to decisions. Thereby promoting participation. Secondly, that well-being indicators help assess the child's overall health, not just their physical condition. And thirdly, there is alignment with UNCRC principles, ensuring that rights are upheld. My lord, the 3 QEUH goals in a hospital setting are as follows. First, reducing anxiety by addressing the psychological impacts associated with hospitalisation through supportive care. Secondly, ensure continuity in terms of maintaining education and family connections where possible. And thirdly, shared decision-making. involving children and families in choices about their care. My Lord, as I've said, GIRFEC aims to align with UNCRC and to ensure that those principles are upheld. There is an obligation in the United Kingdom for professionals working with children and young people, including doctors and executives in charge of healthcare, to comply with its principles and provisions. My Lord, the key principles in my submission of the UNCRC relevant to terms of reference 8 are firstly, Article 3, that the best interests of the child must be a primary consideration in decisions affecting children. The right to be heard in Article 12, which provides children with the right to express their views freely on all matters affecting them, with their opinions given due weight in accordance with their age and maturity. Third, Article 24 relates to health and health services. It states that every child has the right to the best possible health. Governments must provide good quality health care. Clean water. A clean environment. And nutritious food. Article 31 provides that children have a right to leisure, play and culture. And Article 28 provides for a child's right to education.
My fault. The article on education.
28, my Lord.
28, thank you.
My Lord, in my respectful submission, NHS GGC's failures should be understood not only as shortcomings in healthcare and governance, but as a systemic breach of Scotland's own commitments under GIRFEC, the UNCRC, and the duty to use child rights and wellbeing impact assessments when making major decisions affecting children.
Now, the impact assessment, does that have a particular policy or statutory basis?
My Lord, yes, it's attached to GIRFEC. It's part of the larger picture about a wellbeing framework for children. My Lord, the national practice model attached to GIRFEC describes how concerns about a child's well-being should be identified, shared, assessed and acted upon across services, with a coordinated plan and a clear point of contact for the family. It expects services to respond early and proportionately, to communicate openly with families, and to ensure that no child falls through the gaps between agencies. My Lord, I submit that the evidence before this inquiry shows that children in the Royal Hospital for Children and Queen Elizabeth University Hospital were not always kept safe from avoidable harm. Their health needs were not always anticipated and addressed in a timely way, and known risks in their care environment were allowed to persist. Families were left feeling excluded, disbelieved, or marginalised when they tried to raise concerns. Information was fragmented. Planning was often reactive rather than proactive. And the system behaved as if each incident were an isolated misfortune rather than a signal of wider risk. My Lord, that is not evidence of getting it right for every child. It is a sustained departure from the GERFEC principles that were supposed to guide GGC's culture and practice. GGC's failures also sit squarely in conflict with the UNCRC. The UNCRC recognises children's right to life, survival and development, to the highest attainable standard of health, to protection from harm, to information, to be heard in decisions that affect them, and to have their best interests treated as a primary consideration. My Lord, in the context of a children's hospital, those rights mean more than access to a bed and a treatment protocol. Those rights require an environment where preventable risks are actively identified and reduced. Where each child's welfare is placed before institutional reputation. And where children and their parents are fully informed partners in care. My Lord, I submit that the evidence before this inquiry is of avoidable harm occurring in a specialist setting, of delays in recognising and acting on risks, of families not being told the whole story, and of organisational responses that prioritise defence and damage limitation over openness and learning. My Lord, what I've said leads to quite an obvious question of, well, what should have happened? And in my submission in Scotland, child rights and wellbeing impact assessments are designed to ensure that when public bodies make significant changes to policy or service delivery that affect children, they systemically consider how those decisions will impact on UNCRC rights
Just
Sorry,
at
my
this
lord.
point, can I take that? Can I
Sure.
take this just a little slowly? I mean, your pace is entirely acceptable, but I want to get every word here.
Thank you, my lord. Shall I start from the beginning, my lord?
You asked the rhetorical question, what should have happened?
Yes, my lord.
And you then answered that by starting children's rights. Yes.
And well-being impact assessments
Yes.
are designed to ensure that when public bodies make significant changes to policy, or service delivery that affect children, they systematically consider how those decisions will impact on UNCRC rights, and on GERFIC well-being. And my lord, the purpose of such an impact assessment is preventative. Namely, to identify before the event where a proposal might make children less safe, less healthy, less included, or less able to learn, and to respond with mitigation or reconsideration. My lord, within the GERFIC rights-based framework, the failure of GGC to undertake such a wellbeing impact assessment at key decision points is not a mere technical omission. It's evidence that children's rights and well-being were not placed at the centre of decision-making by GGC. And my lord, I'm going to go on and provide you with an example that in my submission supports that position. My lord, when GGC chose to relocate highly vulnerable Schihalian patients towards 6A without any meaningful assessment of how that environment would affect their rights and well-being, it bypassed the safeguard.
Right. And again, it's not so much just the words. I want to sort of understand what you're proposing. So the decision was made round about the 18th of September of 2018 to undertake significant work on Ward 2A. So the question arises where the children are to be accommodated. And what happened was that and tell me if I'm getting the details wrong, that the bone marrow transplant patients would be transferred to the adult BMT ward. The others from the Schihalian unit would be located in what had previously been, I think, a rheumatology ward, which was Ward 6A in the adult hospital. So as at, let's take the date being 18 September what should have happened and what didn't happen.
Well, my lord, I'm going to go on to say.
I don't want to take you out of your structure.
No, not at all, my lord. In essence, my lord, we submit that the evidence of the accommodation of Ward 6A, the evidence of what that provided and didn't provide to the children, and the evidence of the personnel from GGC who were involved in making that decision. There has been no evidence before this inquiry, direct evidence, that these appropriate impact assessments took place. The evidence around the decision to decant was an identification of alternatives to Ward 2A, accommodating the patients. And it was decided that 6A was the best of the options available. However, within that, there is no evidence before the inquiry that the consideration was made of the impact on the children, and to try and either mitigate that impact or reconsider the decision. And my lord, at a later stage in the inquiry's evidence, after some persuasion, counsel to the inquiry asked the question of, was there a business continuity plan? To which the answer was, there is one now, but there wasn't one then. And my lord, the reason why that's relevant is that such a plan, if it had been in place, would have anticipated, say, for example, in the event of fire, that there would have been a proper well-being impact assessment carried out on what do you do with a cohort of very ill children if they require to be accommodated elsewhere. Now, GGC hadn't done that in advance, but in my submission, the evidence before the inquiry doesn't evidence it taking place when the reactive decision was made. And in the event that there was an adminicle of evidence to say, oh, there was some consideration, the poor quality of Ward 6A to address and to meet the needs and the rights of those children suggests it wasn't done effectively. And that's really what I'm going to go on and say in my submissions in a bit more detail, my lord.
Right, well, I'll just follow on your submission. Yeah.
Thank you, my lord. And if it's not clear, please, my lord.
I mean, just maybe to give you a little bit of a heads up, you pointed me to the principles, you pointed me to the impact assessment and the reference to the impact assessment in the GIFRAC document. I am interested in what you say that requires in practice, and this may not be a good analogy. Public authorities have obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. But I don't imagine that every decision maker necessarily applies her mind to Article 8 before she does an Article 8 relevant thing. But that might not mean that she has failed in any way. She may have applied correct principles, but she might have done that without applying her mind to Article 8 of the Convention. So something that I will be interested in listening to you is to know how far you would submit that a decision maker has to be conscious of the source of an obligation and apply any detail that the written statement, in this case, the GIFRAC framework, has to be sort of in the front of the decision-making process, if I've made myself clear.
Yes, my lord, and I can answer that now. GIFRAC is absolutely central to the operation of public authorities. Now, I appreciate that your lordship's inviting me to consider the individual that makes a decision who isn't thinking, oh yes, in terms of GERFEC principles, that's number 2. To some extent, that's really immaterial, as long as the person knows what the Scottish Government has committed to as a welfare and rights-based system that should be central to any decisions that are being made in respect of children. So whether they can be articulated with reference to the article of UNCRC or to GERFEC is far less important than what I would say is the essential and inexcusable failure to not understand what those rights and welfare obligations are. And that no public authority should be making decisions for children unless they are within that framework. And if they're not within that framework, then they're not compliant either with government policy or with legislation. And it is different from some of the human rights that might be, there's the absolute rights to Article 6 to a fair trial, and there's others that have to take account really of the bigger picture. That's not the way this policy works. That is not the way, in my respectful submissions, these rights and obligations work. And therefore, I think, as I'm going to go on to, if one looks at the experience of children in 6A, in my respectful submission, that is evidence that NHS GGC failed to discharge its duties and obligations. Thank you, my lord. The inquiry has heard that Ward 6A was not compatible with the needs of immunocompromised children. The move towards 6A imposed additional burdens on their mental health, education, and family life. In those circumstances, the absence of a child rights and wellbeing impact assessment is itself powerful evidence that GGC did not treat children's best interests as a primary consideration in that decision. The lived experience of children and young people on Ward 6A brings this into sharp focus. The inquiry has heard about the psychological toll of isolation, the loss or degradation of access to education, and the impact on identity and morale for children who were already facing life-threatening illness. Those are not collateral issues. Under GERFEC and the UNCRC, the child's right to education, to play, to participate in ordinary life as far as possible, and to receive care that supports their mental as well as physical health are core rights, not optional extras. When a young person such as Molly Cuddihy described how the environment on 6A affected her to the point that for the first time she felt defeated and accepted interventions she had previously resisted. That is not only a moving personal account. It is evidence that the setting and provision of care were actively undermining her well-being, autonomy, and resilience. Her oral evidence about how the move towards 6A made her feel sick and led her to give in to a feeding tube in circumstances where the environment itself had become intolerable. underlines that these decisions had direct adverse consequences for children's mental health, sense of control, and experience of treatment. When parents' concerns about 6A were dismissed, when children's distress about isolation and loss of education was minimised, and when no structured assessment was undertaken to weigh those impacts before the move, the rights to participation, information, education, and respect for family life were not being honoured. And as I've said, my Lord, had a properly conducted child rights and welfare impact assessment taken place, that would have asked, will this ward keep these children safe? And we must recall, my Lord, that was the ward that had the same water system and the same unvalidated ventilation system. It would also have asked, will it protect their mental health? Will it allow them to continue learning? Will it respect their agency and dignity? And if not, what alternatives or mitigations are required?
Just thinking about this. So you would say the failure to make an impact assessment might lead to another decision. Sorry, if an impact assessment had been made, that might have led the management of the hospital to think about whether the move to 6A was, I suppose, justified. But on the other hand, it might say, well, we have only so much accommodation, and 6A looks to be the best solution. However, if in the absence of an impact assessment, there's at least the possibility of a failure on the part of the decision maker to apply her mind to whether mitigations are necessary, and then if necessary, possible.
Yes, exactly, my Lord.
This is what you're putting forward.
Indeed, my Lord.
Right, okay.
We fully accept that we live in a real world
Yes.
with limitations, and therefore, you know, one can't go, there's no evidence that this was done. So, but one can't go back and say if it had been done and done properly, there weren't alternatives. I would dispute that, but I'm not here to give evidence, my Lord. But in the event that it was conducted and conducted properly, and the decision was, well, we have to work with this, then the next stage is mitigation. Mm-hmm. And that's absent.
Yep.
My Lord, in short, I would say that the decision, that decision illustrates, but it's not the only instance, my Lord, where children's rights were treated as peripheral rather than foundational. And my Lord, I respectfully submit that the inquiry in your Lordship is entitled to conclude that GGC did not just fall short of best practice, it fell short of Scotland's national wellbeing framework for children and of its international human rights obligations. My Lord, that's the end of chapter 1 of my submissions, and with your leave, I'll move on to chapter 2, which considers, in brief terms, a response to Greater Glasgow and Clyde's submissions. My Lord, I begin by adopting the Council to the Inquiry's submissions in respects of paragraphs 1.3, 3.2, 3.4 and 3.6.
That's in the Glasgow Force closing statement.
That was this was the submissions, the oral submissions by
orals.
Mr. Connell, my Lord, at the beginning of the week.
Right.
So, my Lord, I'd first like to comment on the involvement of Greater Glasgow Clyde's position. In short, my Lord, we submit that this is disingenuous. And whilst the change in position is welcomed, it has caused further distress and frustration for the patients and families. There is a complete lack of a candid recognition that the denial and defensiveness that informed the position adopted in position papers, prior submissions, and oral evidence of senior GGC personnel reflected the denial, lack of candour, and defensiveness that similarly informed the interaction of senior management with patients and families. My Lord, the statement that the position has evolved is not only contradicted by the earlier positioning papers and submissions made, but perhaps most clearly by the oral evidence of those who were formerly and some remain part of senior management. My Lord, the second issue is the comment in paragraph 3.2 of GGC's submissions that relates to senior management being committed to patient safety beyond all else. My Lord, we accept that the clinicians and nursing staff at all times did what they considered was best for patients. But we do not accept that all of GGC's senior management were committed to patient safety beyond all else. And the following are a couple of examples amongst what I would say is a substantial body of evidence that's been laid before this inquiry that commitment to patient safety was lacking. My Lord, the first of these is the failure to ensure that the new hospital was validated and safe to be occupied by patients prior to migration, particularly the ventilation system.
I suppose, strictly speaking, the client and building contract could arrange for validation, which I think, as we've understood, is the process of a client taking the advice of an independent engineer or architect, determining whether what it specified had been provided. I suppose strictly speaking, validation is not necessarily about safety.
My Lord, I suppose I'm perhaps not using the term correctly, as commercial and construction is not my field, my Lord. But really, I'm really referring to the evidence of an unvalidated ventilation system, or perhaps the word validation is not the correct one.
No, maybe.
However, the ventilation system in Ward 2A was subjected to an excess of £8 million refurbishment, my Lord. And ultimately, for the patients, they're relying on senior members of GGC, for the board of GGC, that when they migrate patients into a hospital, that hospital is not exposing them to unnecessary risk. And unnecessary risk that a few years later incurs an additional massive spend of public money in excess of £8 million to rectify. My Lord, a similar examples found in terms of the lost DMA Canyon reports. Failure to appoint duty holders, authorised and designated persons who actively discharge their responsibilities. Failure to manage risk effectively. And my Lord, I would submit a clear example of that is the Horn Taps installation, where it was recognised that there were risks and mitigations were recognised, but the mitigations were never carried out. The persistent failure to investigate source of infection. Your Lordship may recall the evidence of Jane Grant, that in response to infection, she didn't seek to look for the source, but only respond to the incident. And perhaps one of the most startling for patients and families is that when the bone marrow transplant unit returned to the Beatson, when it became apparent in July 2015 that Ward 4B was not appropriate in terms of the provided ventilation for immunocompromised patients and did not meet the required standards, that did not trigger any assessment by NHS GGC as to whether there may be issues elsewhere, particularly in other areas where immunocompromised patients were being accommodated. My Lord, I've already mentioned that the evidence of Jane Grant contradicts, the GGC submission at paragraph 6.21, that staff worked tirelessly to identify infection source and mitigate against recurrence. In my submissions, directly contradicted by Jane Grant's evidence. And she's not alone. But perhaps the most important one for many people in this room today is at paragraph 6.19, GGC state that they have rebuilt relationships with patients. .19, my Lord.
Right. GGC has strengthened transparency, improved communication, and rebuilt relationships with staff, patients, families, and external partners. Continues to do so. This includes more timely information sharing and active listening. Patients, families, and staff should have confidence in the services GGC delivers.
My Lord, in my respectful submission, I say there is no evidence that the patients and families who were affected in the 2015 to 2019 period feel that relationships have been rebuilt. The evidence of those whom I represent and the submissions made on behalf of the other patients and families does not evidence a rebuilt relationship, but one of anger, frustration, and extreme distress that has in no way been alleviated, but only exacerbated by the oral and written evidence that has emanated from GGC.
I think I'll look for dictation here.
Yes, my Lord.
I have your submission is that no evidence that the affected families, that in respect of the infected families, relationships have been rebuilt.
Yes, my Lord.
If you could just continue from that.
And my Lord, I go on to say that instead, there's no evidence of a rebuilt relationship, but of the anger, frustration, and extreme distress that has in no way been alleviated, but only exacerbated by the oral and written evidence that has emanated from GGC. My Lord, I refer to extracts of statements from those whom I represent. And I submit, my Lord, that this is the strongest evidence to challenge GGC's position. My Lord, I begin with the words of Molly Cuddihy. Molly provided a statement for the hearing that was due to commence on the 16th of September 2025. Prior to that hearing commencing, Molly died in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital on 26th August 2025 when she was 23 years old. In her statement, Molly commended her clinical team for the care she was receiving, and she goes on to state, "The same cannot be said for the management of NHS GGC, and I feel the evidence they have given only highlights that fact. Their utter contempt for the entire process has been clear, and the total disregard they have shown for the patients and their families has been startling." I mention the physical impact, but it feels like there is no thought given to the psychological torment that patients have been and continue to be subjected to with this. In my own case, it's been the most challenging aspect of my care that has only been compounded by my participation in the public inquiry. My Lord, I should say that I will come back to that statement again, and it does form part of the witness statements before the inquiry. And Molly goes on to say that she doesn't regret at all her participation in the public inquiry. My Lord, since Molly's death, the position of GGC has changed. It's not evolved, my Lord. I would say it's fundamentally changed. And that change in position came at the end of 2025 and has caused indescribable distress to John and Maria Cuddihy. Their incalculable grief and distress following the death of their daughter Molly has been further exacerbated by the fact that Molly did not hear or read of that change in position prior to her death. And for the Cuddihys, that has caused unimaginable pain. If GGC genuinely wish to rebuild relationships with patients and families, they have much work to do. And to start with an apology is a rather obvious suggestion. I remind the inquiry that the GGC Communications Director, Sandra Bustillo, stated that Professor Cuddihy may have won the battle, but he won't win the war. And she did so, and in both her written and oral evidence, she admitted that the language she had used was inappropriate. But she also said that she'd subsequently apologised to Professor Cuddihy. My Lord, that is not correct. No apology has ever been received by Professor Cuddihy from Mr. Bustillo. My Lord, moving on to the statement at paragraph 13.3, where GGC state that it's not appropriate or correct to say that water and ventilation were unsafe. My Lord, I've already made reference to the DMA Canyon reports, the lack of responsible persons to manage water and risk on a continuous basis. Your Lordships heard there was no water safety group and ineffective use of the risk register. And in terms of ventilation, my Lord, at paragraph 13.8, GGC say that given the limited number of infections, the experts cannot identify an increase and so cannot identify a link to ventilation.
Just give me a moment. I'm just
Yes, my
reflecting
Lord.
again precisely on what it is that GGC say. What do you say that GGC, or how do you read
Well, my Lord,
paragraph 13.3?
yes, my Lord. My reading of that is that GGC are inviting your Lordship to find or agree that it's not appropriate or correct to say that water and ventilation were unsafe such that they caused increased risk of avoidable infection. And they go on later in the paragraph, my Lord, to say that water systems and airflow can never be sterile. Other control measures can be used such that there is no avoidable increase in risk. And my Lord, the submission I wish to make in respect of that is that I, in my respectful submission, I accept that being completely void of risk is rarely or ever possible. But organisations like GGC have an obligation to have people, processes in place that identify risk, for that risk to then be recorded and owned, and for that risk to be mitigated, monitored and managed. And my Lord, I would say in respect of water, there are examples. For example, the lost DMA Canyon reports, the failure to appoint responsible persons, ineffective use of the risk register, amongst many examples, including, of course, the expert scientific evidence of the possible link of water contamination to infection that undermines that statement. If your Lordship's content for me to proceed.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
My Lord, in respect of ventilation, I would direct your Lordship to paragraph 13.8 of the GGC submissions. And I want to focus, my Lord, on the statement that given the limited number of infections, the experts cannot identify an increase and so cannot identify a link to ventilation.
Yes.
And Lord, in my submission, we accept that the limited number of infection prohibits experts opining that there is a statistically significant link between ventilation and patient infections. However, we invite your Lordship to look beyond statistical significance of the numbers of infections and rather look at the wider body of evidence to ascertain if the ventilation system in Ward 2A, which has undergone the extensive remedial works I've referred to, resulted in there being an increased risk of infection to the patients who were in that ward. And my Lord, I refer back to evidence that has been before the inquiry of Aspergillus being found in Ward 2A in very high numbers in 2015. To Ailey Mackay's contraction of Aspergillus on the 7th of July 2016, and Pseudomonas on the 9th of July 2016. We say in our submission, my Lord, that Ailey Mackay's experience is an example of a patient being placed at increased risk of infection. We submit that proper consideration of whether the ventilation system adversely impacted on patient safety and care which is raised within terms of reference 1 and the remit to consider the adequacy of ventilation, water contamination and other matters adversely impacting on patient safety and care. In considering that, my Lord, we suggest and submit respectfully that it requires cognizance of the following. And this is a small selection of examples, my Lord. Dr. Argwell's opinion that it would be unsafe due to the unknown nature of any risk to open a new ward that had a ventilation system that had not been validated. I'm impressed on this. He explained that he would be unhappy about an unvalidated space because he would not know if the HEPA filtration was working or if the ventilation system was pushing pathogens in. Miss Dempster's oral evidence, my lord, that there was clearly a risk that was unnecessary for those patients. And my lord, in respect particularly of ventilation, we remind the inquiry that the innovative design solutions in their report on Ward 2 ventilation state in the executive summary that the existing ventilation strategy would appear only likely to promote the risks associated with uncontrolled ingress of infectious aerosols into patient areas. And that's paragraph 1 in the executive summary, my lord.
In relation to that,
Yes, my lord.
we had evidence from the author of that report. I don't recall it being suggested to him that anything in that report was inaccurate. Am I right about that?
That's my recollection, my lord.
Am I right in thinking that as part of the history, Professor Cudahy made reference to that report?
Yes, he did, my lord.
And am I right in thinking that there's a reference in the one of the GGC position papers to that?
I believe so, my lord. I'm less certain of that, but I believe that that is the case.
Yes. Now, what I had in mind was paragraph 51 of positioning paper, the first positioning paper of the 14th of December 2022. Right.
My lord, if you're content for me to move on.
Yes.
This is my last issue in respect of the GGC submissions, my lord, and that relates to communication failures. My lord, I provide 2 examples of this. The first one, your lordship may recall, is in relation to a meeting that took place on the 8th of August 2019, involving Professor Cudahy, Dr. Inkster and Jamie Redfern. And the evidence was around the failure to inform Professor Cudahy of a subsequent Mycobacterium chelonae infection that occurred in the hospital. And despite having asked to be kept informed, the evidence in my respectful submission suggests that there was a decision made not to inform Professor Cudahy, and your lordship may recall that evidence was Dr. Inkster saying to Jamie Redfern, "Tell Professor Cudahy the truth, Jamie." The second example, my lord, is the means by which the hospital communicated with patients and parents who had experienced infections. I'm going to refer, my lord, to the words of Lisa Mackay, Ailey Mackay's mother. and they're found in the witness statement that Mrs Mackay provided for the Glasgow 4 hearing, and is found in the second bundle of witness statements for the September 2025 hearing.
Yes.
And Mrs Mackay states, at no time during our 2016-2017 hospital stay of 338 days was Ailey or us, our parents, advised that her infections were connected to the hospital environment, ventilation system or water supply. It was not until October 2019 when we received a letter from NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde advising that they were investigating infections at the hospital, which then led me to find online a newspaper article dated May 2019. The article spoke of a child, whom I identified as my daughter Ailey, on the cancer ward at the RHC, being infected with Aspergillus in 2016, and how it was suspected to have come from mould in a ceiling void, which developed following a leak. This is how we became aware that the hospital environment was the source and cause of the infections Ailey had contracted, contributing to the ongoing health difficulties she continues to suffer from. My Lord, that completes chapter 2 of my submissions. I'm conscious of the time, my Lord. It's a bit later than I expected.
Well, you've had to deal with questions from me.
My Lord, I estimate 20 more minutes would be required. It may be slightly less because much of what I'm going to refer to is contained within statements that are already before the inquiry, and therefore the speed should increase, my Lord. However, I'm in your Lordship's hands and I'm happy to split the submissions over lunch.
What we might do is break for lunch now. Try and sit sharp at 2, and no doubt you and we'll keep in touch with Mr. Love and see. I mean, there's no reason why we shouldn't sit beyond 4, but I'll leave.
Thank you, my Lord. I'm pleased to confirm Mr. Love has already confirmed he will indulge my overrunning should it occur.
Right. Very well. Well, we'll try and sit again at 2.
I stand.